In written communication, it's permanent. People can say, look what he said.
So often there's an emotional response right at the start.
Because how many people regret what they've done by not taking the time in the first place?
What about the feeling? You know, when you when you actually press send and
then you realize.
And then you feel like you just want to pull it right back. Welcome to Business Builders. We are your hosts. I am Brenton Gowland.
And I'm Ron Tomlin.
And we've, Ron, been doing a series on communication on our podcast. This is the first time we're doing a YouTube video properly. So it's going to be a little bit different today.
Yes, it is.
As opposed to what it's been like in the past. But the communication series that we've been doing has been pretty comprehensive. And we've done probably 8 episodes, I think, on communication. And today is actually our 8th episode. We've done the launch of the series. We've done the art of listening. We've done the power of smarter questions in leadership, which was really good, by the way. We've done being prepared for a crisis, a PR crisis with Mark Williams from Hughes PR. We've looked at difficult conversations, which was also really great. In fact, they've all been great. Mastering nonverbal communication. So what you say when you're saying nothing at all, because people are always talking,
always looking.
Always looking.
Yeah. I'm saying other people are always looking when you're communicating.
Yeah. And our last episode was actually on presenting with impact and authority, which was a really great episode. And today we're going to get into written communication. And when we were doing the pre-chat before we came to record, we talked about back in the day when people just used to write letters. And I remember my father, he was a service manager for Mazda all across the state. And he used to tell me a lot about the ways he communicated, because I think it was something that was really important to him, like it's important to us. And he always used to say to me, Brenton, when you write, make your letters short, make them to the point, and those people who use caps and bold and all those crazy things in their letters to try and emphasize points don't know how to write. I think my father was completely wrong, but it was a different era.
Absolutely.
But it just kind of reinforces the point that the way we construct letters and the way we construct our communications is so vitally important. My father thought it was really important, had very distinct views on how people should communicate in a written format. And I think we've come a long way since then.
Yeah. Well, we have, because we do rely now on emphasizing certain points and so on, using graphic design in our communication, in our written communication. But he's right. When you're talking about written communication, the structure, the format, the tone become very important, mainly because in written communication, we don't have the benefit of all those things that we have when we're talking to somebody. You know, you and I are talking now and we've got feedback. You can talk to me, I can talk to you. We don't have that in written communication. It is very much one way. And there's some benefits to it because it lasts. When we talk to somebody, they can forget what we talked about. They can dispute. They might have heard something different. Written communication, it's more permanent. But we don't have that immediate feedback that we get, and we can't emphasize certain things depending on the feedback we're getting from somebody else. We can't check for meaning as easily. So it's a different way of communicating because it is much more one way.
Yeah, absolutely. Nonverbal communication is so huge because when we're talking to each other, we can feel context. Well, you feel like you can feel it, but it's different things that the other person's emitting in some sort of manner.
I think everyone's been in a meeting where they are talking to somebody, but they're looking at someone else and looking for their feedback. You know, am I saying this the right way without saying anything? And they can give us some type of indication of their thoughts without again saying a word. So we don't have any of that when we're writing. We don't have any feedback whatsoever. And so we need to be a little bit more considerate and careful. But the other side of the coin is that we have time. When we're talking to somebody, we have to think on our feet. When we do written communication, most of the time, we have the time to think about this. And that's a really important point in written communication. You don't usually have to rush.
Yeah.
Right.
So today, as you can probably tell, we're going to be talking about the importance of written communication and how we go about communicating in an effective manner with our words, which often nowadays is in email form, Ron, or social.
Reports, emails, letters, they still happen. But most of the time it's through electronic means that we communicate. And, we're even chatting with somebody, which is much more like writing. Like verbal, but in a written format. So we're, texting, that type of thing.
Yep.
All of that still, we're only getting part of the message, all the message through the written form, but only the part of the message that we would normally try and construe as the receiver from what someone is saying, because all we've got is the words to go by. So texting, that comes into the equation as well in written communication.
So before we get too far into it, just to set the context a bit further, what can go wrong if we don't communicate well?
Well, the first thing is we don't get the message that we want to get across.
And
if we don't communicate well, if we leave it to chance, then what we think we've communicated to somebody, that meaning doesn't necessarily translate to what they perceive we were saying. And I don't know about your experience, but certainly I've sent texts out and I'm very clear in my head what I was trying to say. The person will do something on the basis of that and say, well, I did what you asked, or I did what you told me, or it's nothing like what I meant. That's because I didn't communicate particularly well. And sometimes they can be about things like context.
100%. Text is one thing, but business is another. I've seen examples where people have lost contracts, not won them, or off-sided people, or just really fallen short of the message that, like you were talking about, that they were trying to convey. And there's not a worse feeling than that when you put a lot of effort. Let's say you're doing a tender or doing a proposal, and something in the way you've written it makes that person go, yeah, I'm gonna walk away from this. That is a crushing thing. Or we've seen plenty of examples of people putting something on X now. Used to be Twitter, everyone knows that. And, well, I could cite cases from Australia at the moment where people are in court right now because of things they've written. And it's so prolific. And I think more than ever, this is becoming a real driver for why it's so important to think about what we say and to own what we say, to take responsibility for it, because our words are coming back to bite us in all sorts of ways at the moment.
And I think that comes down to people trying to use a form of communication like texting or X, and they're
Facebook.
They're using what they use in face-to-face and forgetting that there is that level of permanence. If I say something to you, unless it's recorded, there's no record of what I've said. So it becomes what I said versus what you think. And
it's a great point.
Yeah. When you start to use text and the messaging services, there is a record. And so people have to be aware of that. That's why I'm a great fan of what we're going to talk about today, is taking the time when you write something down to think about it beforehand. Yeah. And that starts with thinking in yourself, what am I trying to communicate?
So there's a saying that goes around in different business communities, and people I know who teach people how to do public speaking or whatever, they always say, anything you write down, anything you text to people, assume it's in the public gallery. Even if you're texting people very close to you, assume It's in the public gallery, and we're seeing so much of that right now. So really good context there.
Just ask Brittany Higgins.
Oh, that's who I was going to cite earlier.
No.
That's just an example. If you're not from Australia, that news is, I think that's a reasonably well-known topic, but
it's going through the courts right as we speak.
Right now. We won't go into that, but what we will go into is how to effectively communicate via text. So there's 5 things we're going to talk about today. Firstly, we've got to understand what is it that we need to communicate. Massively important. Who am I going to be communicating that
Just
to?
as important.
Probably more so in a sense, because that can affect retrospectively the message that we were going to deliver. Writing the message, obvious, but then review and proofreading. And I add the word proofreading because too many of us are reliant on spell checks nowadays, and that can get us into trouble on times and occasions.
And getting a different perspective. And I think that's incredibly important. I rarely put anything out that I don't get, and that is in written format, that I don't get somebody else to read beforehand and tell me what they think I meant.
Yeah, and we'll get into that, but that's a ranking thing. How important is this communication, etc. And then this might sound really obvious, but after proofreading, what comes next? Sending the message.
Yeah.
Now you might go, well, isn't that just what we would do anyway? Well, I've still seen people come unstuck when they proofread something and then go to sending the message. Yeah. And then we'll talk about some tools that can help and how to use them. But let's get stuck into it. Ron, lead us off. When we're looking to work out what it is we need to communicate, what's our process? What do we got to be thinking about here?
Well, the first thing is what is the end result? What am I looking for the other person? Why am I doing this, and what do I want them to do as a result? Do I just want them to be informed? Do I want them to adopt a certain behavior? Do I want them to have a certain attitude? What's the end game? Okay, so because I'm not communicating for the fun of it, I'm communicating for effect. What is that effect that I'm looking for? So what's the outcome that I'm looking for? That will then determine how much information I need to supply, how I need to supply. Everything flows from getting my own story straight, as the saying goes. So it will determine whether I need to put context into it, whether I need to give some background. And that comes into the next point too about who I'm talking to. But that allows us to construct the message. And a lot of people, when they're talking to someone else, this all happens in their head. But you've got maybe the luxury, I would say the discipline of putting this down, writing this down beforehand, getting your ideas in a sequential flow, by being able to say, what do I want them, the other person or persons to do as a result of this communication? And so how do I need to structure the message when we talk about putting the message together?
Let's take an example. So an outcome, you get an email from a company you've been working with, and all of a sudden the invoice is double the price. Hold the bus. What are we going to do here? The outcome you want is you want to get the original price that they quoted you and work out what's been going on. So the context is right there. I want what was originally promised. So that then informs how we structure the message.
Absolutely.
What's another example?
Well, it might be that I want somebody to do a certain thing in a certain way because that's important to me. So I'm trying to get a behavior for someone else to be undertaken in a certain way. I will therefore be very specific, be very concise about the way I put that message together, maybe provide more context as to why it's important to do it in a certain way.
Now, a few more business examples. It might be communicating with a client. It might be communicating with a prospective lead that we want to build a relationship with and get work. It might be solving or attempting to problem solve something. So anyway, as you said, there's 3 things you were talking about. What's the outcome we want?
What's the context that we want to put this in, or that we need to put this in? And therefore, what's the way I structure the message to that person?
Yeah, brilliant. So we've got that all in mind. So we know what it is we want to communicate once we've thought those things through. Sometimes it's going to happen massively quickly. Sometimes it's going to take thought, like if we're putting a proposal together, etc. We would literally put a big checklist of all the bits and pieces that we need to consider.
So what's the meaning I want to convey?
Yep.
And then in order to get that across most effectively, I need to think about, and this is an iterative process, I need to think about, who am I talking to?
Yeah.
Because the way I structure the message, the language I use, the amount of context I give, all of those things will depend on who I'm talking to.
Yep.
And we've talked about this before. If you were to communicate to someone who's fairly sophisticated in an area that you are, and that you and that person have proficiency, like if you're an IT professional talking to another IT professional, there's language that I can use that I wouldn't use to someone who doesn't have that same sort of background.
I saw this really interesting thing on Facebook the other day. It was a picture of King Charles. King Charles, I just said that really naturally.
Yeah, I know.
Wow, that's
I was
interesting.
impressed.
Well, everyone in the UK, it seems that I am getting on board with the monarchy over there. Anyway, beside the point, it was King Charles and Ozzy Osbourne. And it was a demographic situation. It said they both live in a castle. They were both from this era. They basically had all the same demographic details, right? And it was, a bit of a stretch, but it was basically saying if you were going to communicate to these guys based on demographic data, you'd be up the creek because they'd both want to hear things very differently.
Yeah. And you need to think about cultural background.
Yeah. So if you don't have a lot of information on people and you're just going by demographics, it really is that chalk and cheese. You really need to know who you're talking to.
Yep.
But there's 3 things that we put down when we were doing our pre-chat, and that is you really need to consider when you're understanding and assessing your audience, the relationship that you have with the people you're writing with. So the relationship is, it might be a family member, it might be a friend, it might be a staff member, it might be a client, it might be someone you don't know, it might be a supplier, et cetera, et cetera. What is the relationship with the person? And what is their perspective? So it's exactly like what you were talking about a moment ago. Are they an IT professional? Are they a geek? Are they a lawyer? Are they a HR professional? Are they an academic versus a tradesperson?
I read a lot of academic journal articles because of the work I do at university, and it's very clear that most of those articles are written for other academics, okay, because of the type of jargon they use, the type of words they use, the assumptions they make about the person, their level of interest in, for instance, research methodologies and so on. So, they are specifically written for a target audience.
Absolutely.
And again, it comes down to who you're writing to, not just specifically, but how many. If you want to write something about your company, customers are a very different audience than people within the organization versus, let's say, bankers. So do you need to have different styles of communication to say essentially the same meaning, but getting across in a different way?
Depends on what you're going to communicate, but often you really do. It's like that King Charles and Ozzy Osbourne example. Both have similar kind of background information if you look at demographically, but very different people.
Absolutely.
Like what you're talking about with academics. Yeah. I've read some of those papers and I've almost gone to sleep when I've been reading them. But
yeah. And that comes down to their perspective. What's their interest in what I'm going to be talking about? If for the sake of argument, if you're talking to somebody who is going to be really impacted by what you're proposing, that could be, you would communicate with them in a completely different way than someone who is just vaguely interested.
Yep. And so probably the last thing you need to think about there, we're talking about a group of people there. You need to think about the quantity of people that you're talking with because, you got the relationship. You understand it's the general public, let's say. It's a group of people in the general public, people who drive a certain kind of car or whatever it may be. How many of them are you talking to at once? Are you talking to the individual? Are you talking to a group? And even if you're talking to a group, sometimes you address it to the individual, but you've got to decide how many people you're actually talking to. Is it many or is it singular? And that will set the tone for how you then write the message.
Yeah. And I think that the rule of thumb is that you work with the person who knows the least.
That's interesting.
Yeah, because if you're going to be talking about something that is going to be one piece of communication goes out to a vast audience, don't assume that they will know that much about it. The people who know a lot about it will skim through the stuff that's contextual or skim through information they already know. But don't assume that everybody, if it's a single communication, don't assume that everybody has the same level of knowledge, and work to the people who have the least amount of knowledge, perspective, interest.
Well, you'll cut, as you are inferring, you'll cut so many people out of actually hearing what you have to say, so your communication becomes ineffective.
Absolutely.
And of course, we are in the effective communication series
right
now. So
that's exactly
we need to focus on being effective in our communication.
And it's incredibly important.
So why don't you take us through writing the message?
Okay, so now we know who we're talking to and we know what we want to say. Yep. It then comes down to how we put that information together to get that meaning across. So structure becomes really important. How we tell the story, the structure of the communication. Do we start with context? Do we start with the impact that we want to have or the behavior that we're looking for and then provide context? What is going to be the best way to get that message across? Structure becomes really important.
Yeah, massively.
And again, storytelling is a great way of thinking about it. How do I take people from one level of understanding to another, or one level of attitude to another, in the most effective way?
And to illustrate what you're just saying there, in a very basic form, a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And if we want to talk about different kinds of stories, they have 3-act plays and all sorts of different structures for how to tell a story. So massively important. But you also, when we were talking about understanding what do I need to communicate, we also started talking about briefly thinking about your structure. So it's like you start right at the beginning thinking, what is my structure going to be loosely? And then once you've understood your audience and you've put your structure through that lens of who am I speaking to, you then rework the structure basically.
And as I say, you've got the benefit in written communication of creating an iterative process.
100%.
You can take time. And I would say to people, we're going to talk at the end about when you send a message and timing is important.
Yeah.
But I would say to people, more often than not, when you're thinking about doing some form of written communication, give yourself the time. Because how many people regret what they've done by not taking the time in the first place, not thinking about it in such a way that they will get their message across most effectively.
Many. We don't even need to give examples because I'm sure
we've
everyone who's listening has seen this.
Well, they've all done it. What
about the feeling? You know, when you when you actually press send and
then you realize,
and then you feel like you just want to pull it right back.
Well, what's interesting is that a lot of email mechanisms now, like Outlook and I use Mail from Apple, they have a quick, you've got 5 minutes to undo the send. Now, how many?
That's the best thing.
You don't create that capability within a system unless there's a vast need for that capability. So I think that's a good indicator of that's something that everyone can relate to.
I'm a bit of a sci-fi fan, and there's this movie that Steven Spielberg did a while back called Ready Player One, and you may or may have you seen it?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, and there's a thing called a Zemeckis cube. I'm a geek. If you hadn't worked that out, well, I'm a proper geek. And
the fact that you know the name for this thing really impresses me.
Well, Robert Zemeckis. But anyway, you throw this thing out and it winds back time 60 seconds. Yeah. And I tell you what you're just saying now, boy, that's probably saved a lot of people.
Yeah.
But when you apply what we're talking about here, you will not need that. You need to have a balanced check system in your head, and we're going through that. So you've just said structure. So after structure, you really want to start thinking about the tone.
And that is what is the way that I'm saying. And when we talk about tone in written communication, it's the niceties.
Yeah.
For some people, they want the please and thank yous. And a lot of people, again, going back to the type of person I'm talking to, some people just want, give me the facts, given dot point form, fantastic.
Yeah.
Other people, how's your day? Hope you're having a fantastic day. You need to determine that, but the tone will be dependent on who you're talking to. But you can change the tone and still get the same message across.
Yeah, but the tone again is it's all hierarchical, not overcomplicating things, but the tone is really going to be determined by what is it we want to convey,
And
exactly what we were talking about, what's the outcome we want, et cetera, et cetera. So outcome, I need to know whether I need to, if that person's got feelings that can be easily hurt, or if that person has a certain idiosyncrasy that I need to consider in my communication. It's so important. Anyway, then we've got formatting. I'm not talking the bold and the whatever. Yes, you need, if your message is long, you need wayfinding in your message. So dot points.
Using headings.
Right.
The length of your paragraphs.
Yep.
Length of your sentences.
Yep.
All of those things either make it easier or more difficult for people to understand what you're talking about.
If you think about it, now I deal with a lot of CEOs and business leaders, so do you. Tell me what format they like.
Oh, report format. Is that
No. In communications.
Concise.
Concise.
And to the point.
I literally have heard so many CEOs say, if you give me more than 3 short sentences, I won't read it.
Yeah, absolutely.
How many times have you heard that?
Well, there's a reason that at the beginning of reports, they have an executive summary.
Because that's the only thing CEOs read.
Yeah, but because that's often the amount of time they have available to read is just the executive summary.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, when I talk to students about writing reports, that executive summary, of course, you write it at the end, but the executive summary should be just that, a summary of what they're going to read and the main points that they're going to come across.
So remember what you just said there. You write the executive summary at the end. But my point was the format for a very busy CEO is usually 3 lines. So that's a format as well. I know that I want 3 lines. A general format is you might have a greeting at the start. You might have the body. So it's your introduction, body conclusion.
Yep.
Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you're going to get straight to the point. If you're dealing with solving an issue, you might have already done the niceties in communication number 1. Now you're just down to bang, bang, bang. We got to be efficient. So you might get down to 1-line communications.
And that gets to the context.
This is format, right?
Absolutely.
So what's my format of this message going to be? Because then you have to really think about what the words are that you put in, because you can only use a few.
Yes. And when you think about it, organizations often have templates of the way we want you to structure the information you're going to provide. Yeah. That's a format. Really, a template is a format. So how do I want to structure this information to get the effect I'm looking for?
Yeah, and we will talk at the end about tools that you can use that if you don't have access to those kind of structures, that will have those kind of structures for you. So the other thing really is then just writing the first draft. So you understand what the structure is that you want to use, the tone, and the way you want to format it, whether it's going to be a longer piece where you're going to have wayfinding like headings and dot points and so forth, because dot points are much better, particularly in corporate communications or communications with business people, than having a big, long, waffly something. I remember in one of the companies that I led, I used to have to go and get feedback from people to work out if we were on point with our work. And there was a particular person who was very meticulous in our organization. And that person would write everything in these massive long emails because they didn't want to miss anything. So we weren't liable for anything, which then, of course, went to the managing director. The managing director sat me down and said, I am not going to read any of this person's communication. if they cannot concisely convey.
Hmm.
And so then I remember having to go and deal with that situation. And that was very hard for that person to snap out of that.
Yeah, and there's a famous, and it's attributed to a number of different people. I've read up on it. It's actually Blaise Pascal, the mathematician. And he said, look, I'm sorry that my letter is so long. I didn't have time to make it short.
Yeah.
And most people attribute that to Winston Churchill, but it doesn't matter. The point is so many people over the aeons have said the same thing. It takes a long time. And that gets us to our next point of the first draft is the idea of proofreading and editing.
And usually shortening.
Oh, yes.
So honestly, this is the most important part, this iteration part you were talking about.
Yeah.
Even if you're sending a text to a loved one, I have got in the habit of putting time between whatever communication I get, even if it's half an hour, just to write it and then think about it and then edit it and send it off when I'm convinced that it's going to convey the message that I want to convey.
Yeah.
But yeah, take us through the review and proofread section, Ron.
Well, I think what you're aiming for is clarity, and oftentimes clarity is made better by simplicity and not using jargon, that type of thing. But looking at what you've written and trying to simplify it to a level that your audience is going to find easiest to understand.
Yes.
And so, there are things, and we've just talked about before, about the length of your sentences, the nesting of ideas within a sentence,
yes,
the length of your paragraphs. Shorter paragraphs are easier to get a single message across. So I've unfortunately seen a lot of essays and reports written by students that are the paragraphs are a page long. It's very difficult to get the ideas. If you confine one or two ideas to a paragraph, or confine your paragraphs to have only one or two major ideas, it's easier for people to break down the concepts that you're trying to get across. So all of that comes into, have I done that? I've got the first draft that you were talking about before. Fantastic. Now, into how do I format that? So again, it's an iterative process, and you have the capacity to do that when you're writing.
If you are just doing normal communications, this might be a 5-minute process. Seriously, because particularly if the relationships are close, like a staff member or team member or associate, you know them fairly well. So this whole process will happen in your mind, but this same process is, what we're talking about is an in-depth process here that we can reduce down for our need. So we've just talked about reviewing and proofreading. And in my view, that is the most important part of the whole process. I'm not making light of anything else, but this is where people come unstuck.
Yeah, because they don't do it.
Correct. Because you write a thing and send it, and then you read it back later and you realize, one, you might have grammar problems or spelling mistakes and you look a bit silly.
And nowadays, unfortunately, people underestimate the value of using grammar properly.
Yep. But there's another thing, right? I have noticed that people forgive mistakes and grammar problems a lot more than they used to. Like my father would have had a conniption if he got some of the communications I get from grown adults. Because we've come to forgive people because of I believe it's because of the whole texting and social media thing, because we've developed new language, and that's fine, but it still makes us look a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, again, what am I trying to get across? And part of what you're trying to get across is not only the information, it's the perspective or their perspective who you communicate to about you as an authority, as someone that can be trusted, as someone that has good information, that is knowledgeable. So, if you're conveying, you might get the message across, but you might have lost the person's trust or confidence in you because of the way you got that message across.
And I think what you were saying just there, that whole authority piece and trust and so forth, is exactly what we're talking about. Because we're talking, obviously, Business Builders is all about growing business leaders, whether you're an emerging business leader or a veteran already, that you've been doing it for years. It's It's about establishing our brand, really. And how we write really reflects our personal brand, which we'll talk about at another point. But it creates a perception, particularly if people haven't seen us, creates a perception about us. Now, look, I might also say one thing that just in this review and proofreading section that's so important. When it's really important and the stakes are high, often getting another perspective.
I rarely send out communications to other people that I have not got someone else to read beforehand.
What sort of communications? Because I'm assuming if you're sending something general like we were talking about earlier, you don't need to.
Even emails, but certainly reports.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm writing something that matters, I will get somebody else to read it. Even my emails, if they're important emails, I'll get someone else to read it beforehand because we know what we want to say. We're very clear about it in our heads. Does that mean that we have communicated that effectively? Sometimes we think we have. I mean, if no other mechanism is available to you, you've got the pause. And what I mean by a pause is put your draft together, proofread it, then walk away.
I've heard that defined as
and come back to it.
I've heard that defined as the gap, creating. It was you who told me about that?
Mind the gap.
Mind the gap. Tell me about that. I really like this.
We talked about that in our verbal communication.
Yeah.
You know, when you're responding.
So we both talked about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, who told me about this?
But it was it comes from the underground in the UK. You know, they talk about mind the gap. Well, there is a gap between the way, what you hear and your response to that. And so you have the potential when you're writing things to create a space between the process of writing and going back and reviewing. And if it might be that you create an email that might be very important, take a pause, go have a cup of coffee, walk around the garden, whatever it is, come back and read it with the perspective of how will I, or how will this other person, and how do I now perceive what's being communicated? What message do I get from this with a little bit of space between the process of writing and the process of reading?
So it basically gives us time to grow perspective. Okay, and I can give you lots of examples of that, but we're running out of time, so we got to keep moving.
Or get somebody else to do it. You don't have to do it yourself. But sometimes,
what do you mean?
Well, get somebody else to read it.
Yeah. That's the other perspective. But I thought you were talking about minding the gap.
Yeah.
So the gap thing for me is about giving me time to allow my own subconscious and other senses to make sense of what's happening. So often there's an emotional response right at the start.
Oh, yeah.
But I think the other person's perspective does that as well. So you're right.
Yeah. But here's the other thing, especially if there's high emotions involved. Somebody writes me a communication, and I want to send something right back. The opportunity, because you do not have to, when you're talking to someone face to face or on the phone, you have to respond right away. Although I'd still say there's a gap. But
we can talk about delay methods later on.
Yeah, you could pause.
You could pause,
but certainly when you're writing something, you have the opportunity. You do not have to respond immediately. And when I say immediately, you could leave it 5 or 10 minutes. Take the opportunity to get the emotions out of things and respond in a way that is at least considered, because then in written communication, it's permanent. People can say, look what he said. Now, you can't say that over the phone. They can say, he said this and there's a record of it. But in written communication, there is a record later on. So people can look at the exchange. And this often happens in court, even in texting. In court situations, people look at the way people talk between each other. And unfortunately, there's a permanent record of it there. So take the opportunity to mind the gap, especially, I would say, when emotions are involved, when you're responding to something.
Yep. So moving on, What do you do after you've done the proofread? Are you ready to hit the button?
Well, you can.
Well, notice how we say hit the button and not put it in the post. We still put things in the post.
Yeah. We still. I haven't done that for a while, I have to admit. I would say final check.
Final check.
Who do I need to send this to? What am I saying? Am I comfortable that, as you say, if this were to get out into the press, that I'd be comfortable that I'm happy for other people to see this.
And that's a good check and balance, by the way. Always asking yourself, is the communication I'm about to put out, if that got out into the public, what would that do to my reputation? Would that make me liable for anything?
Yeah, and that's the extreme. But also, if this person said, hey, look at what Brenton just sent me, would that other person say, well that's pretty it's pretty reasoned, that's a reasonable response given what you sent to him? Or would they say, well, obviously he's in this sort of frame of mind? Or what would another person say if they were looking at that as well? Because there is a permanent record. And I can't emphasize that enough. And it might be that that person takes the time to think about that and looks back at it and doesn't immediately respond. But what will their response be as a result of that communication that you send? So thinking about that, thinking about who you're sending to, it could be one person, it could be multiple people. Oftentimes, for instance, when I respond to something, I will copy in, if this is an email, I will copy in other people so that they can see the response that I'm providing as well.
Sure.
That's contextual. And when do you send the response? Doesn't have to be immediate. That's the good thing about written communication. But even, look, I get emails sometimes from people on the weekend, right? I don't look at them till Monday. But if I'm scrolling through my email feed, something that's sent on the weekend doesn't seem as urgent or important as something that's sent during the week. Does that have an effect on people's perception of that communication?
Oh, it's also, there's a big movement and a big push towards keeping work hours now in Australia. I'm not sure what's happening in other parts of the world, but in other words, there's a right to disconnect.
Yes.
Have you heard much about this?
Yes.
So the right to disconnect, if it's not happening where you're from, is basically when an employee leaves work, they should be able to disconnect from work. And if the boss or someone is messaging at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, which happens a lot, just watch Devil Wears Prada. Bit of an extreme example and fictitious, but probably not. I've been in situations where I've seen that happening. Then it really changes. It puts pressure on someone. So timing is about respecting other people. So I'm the kind of person who will write, I do this all the time. I'll write 3 or 4 emails at 12 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, whenever I'm finishing a project. And then I will schedule them to go at 8 o'clock in the morning or 9 o'clock. Because one, I want to teach people how to treat me, is that keep your communications during business hours. And two, I want to respect them. But that's one example. There's all sorts of other examples. Timing could be, I got to wait for a certain event to happen because then this will have more meaning. Like I got to wait for a particular episode of Game of Thrones. I'm being facetious.
That's an extreme example.
But look, just in summary, when it comes to written communication, you can see there's a structure. And just reiterating the structure, what is it that we need to communicate is the first thing we need to establish. Who am I communicating it to is the second thing we need to establish. The third thing is we actually need to write the message. Then we need to review and proofread, really important to proofread. And then we need to check the message before we send it again. So it really is, like you said, an iterative process, but it's check, 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 and check. I've seen people proofread and review a thing and go through it. And because we had this saying in the advertising agency that I run is, and I'm sure it happens everywhere, I'm too close to this. I can't see it anymore. I need someone else to read it. And particularly when you're doing tenders, because you've gone through it so many times and there's so much to them, you can't see the wood from the forest from the trees anymore. So you need another perspective. If it's only emails that are that long, sure, some of them might take longer, but the point is check, 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 and check. Time if you can. And that really will help you with your communication. But on that, you were talking about there being templates in businesses and so forth. Yes. So what if you're a aspiring business leader or even a business leader who's doing things on their own? Where do you find the help? And that's where our beautiful technology comes in, I think.
Even in a lot of the word processing programs at the moment and email,
it's all getting built in.
Yeah, it's all being built in. There are spell checkers. There are grammar checkers. There's things called like Grammarly. Grammarly keeps popping up all the time.
I used that for a few years.
Yeah.
It was awesome.
Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with saying, I don't want to necessarily spend all this time. Are there tools that I can use to make sure that my communication is more effective?
Of course, a lot of what I do now is I run things through AI, but I don't just go, hey, write this for me. I usually go through this process, write what I need to write, and then put it in and say, check for flow, grammar, and this, that, and the other. I don't always agree. But gosh, it's helpful.
Yeah, so there are now AI tools to help you.
Built in to everything.
There's the old-fashioned tools like dictionaries and thesauruses.
Well, don't write them off because
not at all.
Sometimes it's about understanding the context of things. The thesaurus has been my best friend on many, many occasions, but that's usually when I'm writing something that really matters.
If you're worried about, in general, how your communication is going, you can use tools like the Gunning Fog Index. I'm not going to go into that now.
No, we don't have time.
No, but you can look up the Gunning Fog Index and see whether your communication is cluttered or foggy or whether it's clearer. And that's why it was
there's a writing index in Grammarly. I forget what it's called. And it's a very common structure. I haven't looked it up. I may go and look it up later, but I'm sure you can find it. It basically tells you what age group you're writing for. So I think common practice is if you want it to be accessible to most people, you write it as if you're writing it to a year 8 student.
Right.
Not is this an academic level paper where the words, as we were talking about, are this long and it makes you tired reading it because you got to go, what does this word mean? Yeah. What does that word mean? I got to go research this word so I can write it. Or is it, and like you said, you rule people out if you don't go for the lowest common denominator.
Yeah.
And what I mean by the lowest common denominator is not a disrespectful thing, but where their communication level is.
The least knowledgeable and sophisticated person that you are trying to communicate to.
And there is a saying as well, just to put this into context, because I don't want this to seem like we're elitist, but they say that true genius can explain very complex things to a 4-year-old and have them understand it. Now, that might be a little bit of a stretch, but the meaning is right. If we really understand a thing, we can make it seem very simple. So I think that's pretty much all we got time for today.
It is indeed.
So this is our first video of the Business Builders material. And I've got to admit, I felt a little bit intimidated at the start, Ron. I didn't know what to do with my hands. I still probably don't. It's a bit different. We've done the podcast so many times that it's just natural.
Yeah.
Now I'm like, I'm being watched.
Yeah. And we have the benefit and the discipline required now of having visual communications, the way we use our hands, all that extra.
The way we cross our arms.
Yeah. All that extra communication information that is out there now in the video. So hopefully we'll get better at communicating more effectively.
Okay. And next episode is going to be really interesting. We're going to talk about how your business communicates via its brand. So basically branding communications. And you were saying when we were having this discussion, well, that's communicating without
visually.
Words.
Yeah. And it can be, but the words matter as well.
Yeah.
But oftentimes brands tend to communicate visually because that's where most people, the meaning comes from in the visual communication. What pictures do they use? And
that's why the industry is called exactly what you just said, visual communication. When I went to college when I was younger, I did a visual communication course. And visual communication, let's call it that. Yeah. Visual communication. This is not really a marketing and branding thing. This is us talking about effective communication through your brand, through your business. But anyway, until next time, business builders, keep on building.